Through May 12, 2019, the Barnes Foundation is showing a terrific bunch of early European photographs from the collection of Michael Mattis and Judy Hochberg. Eager to see it, I thought, why go by myself when I can get free commentary by the great Don Camera, my go-to source on all things photographic. Though it did not, in fact, kill painting, photography did become painting's fine art rival, as this marvelous show makes very clear. It's organized into subject matter categories, but Don doesn't think that was what the collectors were thinking when they got these photos.
This is a show that, in my opinion, was collected because of the quality of the individual photographs and the objects. It's not a subject-driven, theme-oriented collection. If there was any theme at all, it would be just the best of the best. The oversized prints, the mammoth plate prints that only the aristocrats could afford. The prints that were made for museums and libraries. These were the prints where the photographers maybe only made one or two or three. Most prints for the average man, which photography is mostly associated with, would be 8 by 10 or smaller. The carte de visite, the little tiny calling card that was literally only a penny a piece. These were the most expensive images. This obviously is a 21st century giant blow-up of one of the pictures inside one of Peter Henry Emerson's naturalism prints. I thought I would just maybe go for a little ride with the guy maybe later on, but the guards told me I couldn't jump into the photograph, so I can't do that. The thing that's most beautiful about these is the uniqueness of each print. They were the best of the best, the creme de la creme, as they say in France. Some of the finest photographs that were ever made in the history of photography. These could be the best example of the mammoth plate, the oversized negative, contact prints. Truth and fidelity to detail applies to these the most. These were done by the earliest, greatest architectural photographer, Edward Baudu. He photographed the building of all the great buildings, the rebuilding of Paris in the 1860s with Haussmann and Napoleon III. He documented it all. Great floods, anything that happened in France between 1855 and 1870, this was the guy that documented it with his huge mammoth plate camera, so the detail of what actually happened was just absolutely off the charts, however you want to talk about it.
I am a sucker for Peter Henry Emerson. Tour guide Don, give me some info.
Emerson was an amazing guy because he believed that the human eye only sees one thing sharp at a time. Everything else is soft and peripheral. So when you look at these pictures, there's really only one point of sharp focus, and it's oftentimes very shallow, and everything in front and behind is out of focus. So he was very insistent on following that scientific belief, though creating images that harkened back to the old days, that pre-industrial time. He believed in science, but he also believed in the rural farm life. So that's what made him so amazingly interesting. This is a great example of the quality of the oversized print. This print is from 1855. This is a salt print, meaning before they invented glass negatives and albumin prints. This is the earliest process of paper photography. The emulsion is embedded in the paper. The salt sinks into the paper where albumin sits on the surface of the egg white. This is a much softer, much more similar to a hand-drawn kind of quality. And then the optical illusion, look at this picture. The background is like right on top of the boat. There's just a little channel of water that this huge ship sits in, and then all this activity, layer and layer and layer, plane after plane after plane, and then here comes this background, right up against everything. There's no such thing as an enlargement. The negative produced was as big as the image you're looking at. It's 11 by 14, 12 by 15. That's how big the negative was. That means the camera had to be 8 times that big to support such a negative. The detail is over the top. Roger Fenton was the first photographer sent to the Crimean War, 1854 to 1856, the first war heavily photographed. He wasn't alone, there were other photographers, but he was the most prominent of them. And he just documented everything, anything people wanted to see back at the homeland. The equipment, the people. There was a strict gag order. You don't show any British suffering. You don't show anything that shows we're getting our asses kicked, which they were at times. The charge of the Light Brigade was written because the greatest fighters were sent into an absolute suicide mission due to, insane aristocratic generals that just wanted to win. So lots of problems and lots of gag orders for the photographers, and they followed them. You didn't see any dead bodies during the Crimean War.
Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600.
Now, one of the hardest working wartime photographers was a guy named Felix Beato. He was just a commercial giant of all kinds, with photography being a big part of what he did. And when it came to documenting the violence of war, this particular shot is an amazing example. Beato had no problem photographing dead bodies, in this case, non-European dead bodies. I think if these were white European soldiers, you would not see this picture, but because they are the vanquished, the public was dying to see it. So you get pictures like this. When you look close at this picture, it's as brutal as war gets. So these were all official photographers of the British Army. And when you see these pictures, you can just learn so much about the times. I always used to tell my students, there's no such thing as a time-traveling machine, except when you can really immerse yourself in a 19th century photograph. Look at this with the cannons surrounded by macrame of ropes. What was that all about? Right next to these incredibly brutal war pictures are incredibly beautiful portraits by Julia Margaret Cameron. And to me, it's a little odd to have this juxtaposition right here. But nonetheless, Julia Margaret Cameron, a pre-Raphaelite, the wife of a former government official. In her 50s, her kids thought, Mom needs something to do. So they bought her one of these new collodion photography outfits. She was a lover of art. She took to it immediately. All these high-powered people would visit her, like Tennyson and John Herschel and all really important people. And she would photograph them. And she really believed in this very soft, emotional, pre-Raphaelite vision. These were about feeling, not facts. And when something was out of focus, it wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. But she did have a disdain for commercial photography, for the sharpness, for the crispness, for the detail. To her, that was unfeeling. She wanted to be an artist. Before she died, she got some fame for her work, but she was truly the predecessor to naturalism, pictorialism, and all those soft focus isms that would come thereafter. And in this particular collection, there's a ton of Julia Margaret Cameron. From what I understand, the husband and wife that put this collection together really love her work. They named their child Cameron. Something that every photo collector loves is portraits of photographers. Charles Nègre, a painter who used photographs as etudes for his paintings, models, study guides. And when he poses, in my opinion, it's a very pretentious, self-conscious image as an ancient sage. Nadar, on the other hand, was a wild man. He was a trendsetter. He did everything that was cutting edge, everything that no one else had done before. He was a risk taker. And here he is in the catacombs with early primitive electric lights, holding his breath, doing very long exposures underground. It shows the character of the man. You know, this guy is incredibly serious, and I'd much rather be at a dinner party with Nadar. Another portrait of Nadar. You're looking into the face of a really courageous person, a guy who risked his life going up in hot air balloons, making the first aerial photographs, going down into the catacombs with noxious fumes and gases. Nadar sought out the extremes in life and wanted to document them in photography. That is the face of a hero. Not only was Nadar the photographer's photographer because of his courageousness, but he also was the most celebrated celebrity photographer of the 19th century. Everybody wanted to be photographed by Nadar. He had the first electric light sign on his 3-story studio, Nègre, across the top. Every time I looked at it, I always thought it was enhanced after the fact, but I found out that he had the first electric light made with a weak little battery that spelled his name out. So in 1867, with all the little gas lights on the street level, 40 feet in the air, you'd see Nègre's name, 18 feet stretched across the top of his building. This guy knew how to bring attention to himself. He was the man.
One thing I enjoyed about the Barnes show was seeing real-life images related to the PBS Masterpiece theater dramas that my wife and I are so addicted to. The televised Les Miserables began last Sunday, and here is Nègre's portrait of its author, Victor Hugo, on his deathbed. In Victoria, we see the soon-to-expire Prince Albert feverishly working on his Crystal Palace for the Grand Exhibition of 1851. We get to see this palace being built in a photo by Philip Henry Delamotte. And this one, also by Delamotte, shows an exhibit at the Grand Exhibition of extinct animals and dinosaurs. We also get to look at a bunch of famous 19th century cultural icons, like Aubrey Beardsley, an influential illustrator who died at 25. And Alfred Tennyson, the great poet who wrote The Charge of the Light Brigade that I quoted from earlier. And who wouldn't want to take a gander at the corpse of Emperor Maximilian, nicely attired in a jacket of many buttons? In this pair of images of the young French imperial prince tied to his pony, you get to look behind the scenes of the photo shoot. Both France and England were major imperial powers, and we get to see images of people from non-European countries. Here's Nègre's portrait of 2 Japanese diplomats with a French military officer. Here are a couple of portly Jewish women from Tunisia. And Julia Margaret Cameron photographed 2 women from Ceylon. She also made this image of an Ethiopian prince. There are a bunch of daguerreotypes, the earliest form of photo imaging, that show us just how much better dressed people were in the 19th century than we are today. Well, I guess I'm really only speaking for myself and Dawn.
This is a great example of one of the most outrageous photo subjects of the 19th century, the Countess of Castiglione. I'm sure I'm saying it incorrectly. But she would commission artists of all kinds to make portraits of her, and photographers were on the top of the list. There are hundreds and hundreds of portraits of her. Very sexy, very flirtatious. She just knew how to pose in front of the camera. She could vogue long before voguing was an official word. The original base would be an albumin brown-toned photograph, and then an artist would go to work with oils and transparent tints and dyes, and they would, in this case, totally recreate the image of the siren from the ocean, or whoever she thinks she is at the moment. She was the most egotistical person, probably, of her day. As my mother used to say, "Oh, I love me, who do you love?"
Well, it's not exactly something I love, but I do have a certain interest in Victorian-era erotica. Anything along those lines in this exhibit, Don?
So there are 2 absolutely true facts about the invention of photography. The day after photography was born, somebody figured out how to tell a lie with it. And number 2, the softcore porn industry, a la photography, was created. These are 3D daguerreotypes. In other words, you put them in a 3D viewer, and this imagery melds together in your brain, and you see a three-dimensional young lady lifting her leg up to give you a little view of what might be under there. It was a very powerfully realistic visual, and as it says in the card, those practitioners sometimes ended up in jail for a few weeks under obscenity laws.
The people in these pictures are clearly being directed to pose in a salacious manner. In fact, many, if not most depictions of people in art history and in early photography have a more or less self-consciously staged quality to them. In the genre section of the show, Don points out how that all began to change.
So we're now in the area of the show that they refer to as genre scenes, scenes of everyday life. Frank Sutcliffe in 1886 does a very famous picture. They call it Water Rats, a bunch of kids just skinny dipping. We've gone from the still, very almost pretentious poses of Julia Margaret Cameron to much more spontaneity. Just a bunch of kids hanging out on a little rowboat, taking a swim on a Saturday morning. So there's something very of the moment. And by 1886, when this image was done, that was the prominent aspect of where photography was going. And anyone that made slow, deliberate poses, they were bucking where things were going. I'm not saying they were doing it wrong, they were just doing it their way. And by this time, a lot of the early photographers thought, I'm not even interested in photography anymore. It's not what I thought it was. It's become this snapshot, because this is really the predecessor to the snapshot. 1886, when does Kodak invent the camera? The first Kodak camera, 1889. So the nature of spontaneity was about to blast its way into the mainstream, but in the hands of seasoned photographers, that same Kodak spontaneity existed, and this is one of the best examples.
Moving from the genre section of the show to the landscape area, your curiosity about Don's odd-looking headgear will finally be satisfied.
We're now in my favorite room for the show, which is the landscape room. Again, really large, oversized prints, mammoth plates that document nature to such a spectacular degree. Gustave Le Gray was one of the best early landscape photographers. Early photographers had an inherent problem. Whenever they get a perfect exposure for the ground, the sky would always be bright white and overexposed. They could never really balance it out. So he did a simple split printing technique where he made an exposure for the ground, he made a second exposure appropriately for the sky where the ground would go black, and then just very carefully did a simple little horizontal slice. Everything here with the sky is done the same way by him, and then he would get the balance of the proper exposures, giving them the drama that he really wanted. And the thing that is most spectacular about this print is all in the darkness over here. That's why I brought these things, because I really wanted to look close at the detail in those waves. Unbelievable. I think that all the energy that the landscape photographers were trying to create, the Alexander Coates and ink splots of the 1700s, Corot and all this quick cliche there printing work that they would do, I think they were all inspired by the kind of detail that Gustave Le Gray could capture in these waves. There's an energy in here. There's a splashing power. This was something that had been done before by painters, but it was the first time the camera actually captured it in such a way. Another Gustave Le Gray, an even better example of his split printing technique. Two different negatives. And if you really come close to this one, you can see kind of a bright, thin line that hovers over the horizon, which is where it was not quite as perfect as he would have liked. And when you get close with this, no question about it, there is a bright line just kind of hovering over the landscape, and it's pretty evident right over here, I think, where the clouds go dark. So that's where Gustave missed it, but Does it really matter? I don't think so. More examples of the objectness of the beauty of this show. These carbon prints by Adolphe Braun are just so incredible. Every one is a different color because you can pigment these prints. You can alter them any way you want. You're mixing the emulsion yourself. You're then working it into the carbon pigment and pressing it into the paper. If you're into detail, I mean, just the way those trees vibrate off in the distance and the tonal range is so wide and so deep and so expansive and so subtle and so rich and so full. It was put into a machine that would press it to the tune of 5,000 or 6,000 pounds of pressure into the paper. So the carbon print are the most permanent print. You could put this in direct sunlight for 100 years and it probably wouldn't fade that much. This whole corner of the room is just filled with amazing objects. I mean, this is so dramatic. It's not pictorialism in the traditional sense, but it is, I think, in the literal sense, emulating every painting he's ever seen, but with the everydayness of that moment in Italy, with your character standing here and the stark quality of this tree. No painter would spend 2 months painting a picture with a giant tree right in the middle of the foreground. But with a photographer, it's not nearly as big a commitment, so they can experiment, they can play around, and this surprising spontaneity and shock value always is a potential thing. And that's one of the beauties of the creativity of photography. You didn't have to invest months in a picture. In a couple hours, you can complete an idea, and that gets you on to the next idea. And one thing leads to another, and before you know it, you got progress, you know? So we have this incredible Adolphe Braun filled with detail. You know what you're looking at from far away. It's easy to understand, very academic. Then we move over to one of the Gustave Legre's, a tree in the forest of the Fontainebleau. This was such a fertile time for not only processes, but for a vision, for aesthetic vision, where that's so documentary crisp. This is so abstract. This tree is coming at you in almost like a tidal wave of photographic information flooding at you. When you look close, you see the trunk of the tree, you feel the architecture, but what is that in the background? Rorschach test of random ink? Or does that make sense? To me, this is really an abstract picture. This to me is like the blunt force of nature.
On April 10th, 2019, one day before Don and I visited the barns, an image of nature at its most forceful was revealed to the public. I mentioned it to Don, who had not seen it, but he headed us over to see some photographs that show the progress of science and technology over the last 100 or so years.
That was what was so amazing about photography. It was the tool to the modern artist. It was the servant to science.
118 years before we got to see a black hole, J. Milton Ophir took a 2-hour exposure of the night sky to capture the Milky Way.
What is this? The foot of a spider. Someone was able to hook a camera to a microscope and started making early microscopic photographs. Imagine artists that have futuristic instincts, and they start to see stuff like this, and they see nature on such a microscopic level and learn about symmetry and patterns like they've never seen before. Look at these things.
There may have been a bit of pseudoscience as well. Here the photographer is attempting to capture auras of spiritual energy, which would help to prove the existence of ghosts and other spirits. But we saved Don's favorite scientifically inquiring mind for last.
This is from that book, Picturing Time, about Marais. He had the camera that had a moving disc inside. On that disc were 13 different exposures, and as the subject would move, the camera would be cranked, the disc would spin, and when the subject and the negative lined up through the lens, ba-boom, exposure, ba-boom, exposure, ba-boom, exposure. So you made 13 very quick images in succession. He was not a photographer, he was a scientist, the study of movement. but it produced the most amazing futuristic images. We see a man running, jumping, bending, and coming up again. And maybe 8 representations of that guy. So he chose 8 of those 13 negatives, straightened out the image by reprinting them in various forms. These are positive glass slides. But this is the really amazing thing. This is the negative, because in reality, this was a black background. And all those lines were actually white lines. He put up a black background. He had a specially designed black skin-tight suit with a hood and special boots. And on all the moving parts of the subject, he put a white, bright bar, sewed it onto the outfit, right? He then puts that person in front of a black background. What happens? Contrast makes the three-dimensional form disappear, black on black. What does the camera see as those 13 images are made, as it swings past the lens? Just the white bars that reflect back, almost like a graphed, computered image. But this is in reality a photograph from 1884, 1885. Other pictures by Marais look exactly like nude descending a staircase. And Duchamp refuses to acknowledge that he was aware of these things, but he was aware of these things.
Darn you, Marcel Duchamp. Not only did you refuse to admit that photography has killed painting, you became famous by stealing the ideas of your betters. The Barnes Foundation Early Photography Show will be ending on May 12th, 2019.
The objects are so spectacular. Pictures that, in my opinion, are things that you'll never see again.
Our little movie has only examined a fraction of the 250 objects that are in this show. Don's right. Go to the Barnes now and see for yourself la creme de la creme of early photography.